Story 1. Hans Landa, in Inglorious Bastard, was so charmingly evil that it felt acceptable to enjoy every scene he appeared in. Story 2. Do you know what nemesis means? A righteous infliction of retribution manifested by an appropriate agent, personified in this case by a horrible cunt me. Story 3. Moriarty. Perfection. When he and Sherlock shared the screen, they killed it. Story 4. My wife says Loki or Michael Myers. She is a Tom Hiddleston fan. My vote goes to Darth Vader. Luke is just whiny. Story 5. As a kid, I enjoyed the villainous duo Boris and Natasha and wanted them to annihilate Rocky the Flying Squirrel and Bullwinkle Moose. Story 6. Handsome Jack is from Borderlands 2. Undeniably a villain, he is the corporate chief executive officer of an arms manufacturer. Still, he had more charisma and appeal than any of the heroes, including the non-player characters. Story 7. Do not get me wrong, the character Clarice is amazing, but Sir Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter was brilliant. Story 8. I have always loved Ursula, a powerful lawyer with fabulous tentacles. Story 9. I think people enjoy the Joker far more than Batman, generally speaking. Story 10. Sheriff of Nottingham, played by Alan Rickman. Mr. Benedict, played by Charles Dance. Story 11. Boyd Crowder in Justified. Walton Goggins killed that role. Story 12. Simon Phoenix in Demolition Man always looked so happy and seemed to be having so much fun. Story 13. Thanos. Terrifying logic, calm confidence, and a plan he actually committed to. Story 14. It's fascinating how the best villains often have a point you can almost sympathize with or a charisma that is just magnetic. Magneto's tragic backstory and understandable motives make him compelling, while a villain like Hans Landa is purely captivating in his portrayal of evil. Moriarty, though, is the perfect intellectual foil, making every confrontation with Sherlock electric. These characters work because they genuinely challenge the hero, not just physically but also ideologically and mentally. Story 15. The Sheriff of Nottingham. Who in their right mind would choose Kevin Costner over Alan Rickman? Story 16. Alan Rickman as the Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Story 17. Nothing will ever come close to Heath Ledger as Joker. He absolutely nailed it. His performance makes you analyze his words, his acting, his laugh, and, most importantly, his attitude of not caring about money. He embodied the moral challenge of breaking the code that Batman followed, and that is what makes it so interesting and next level. I wish Heath could have played more villains, but with the Joker he created an aura no one could ever match. Story 18. Michael Keaton's Vulture in Spider-Man is a blue-collar worker who grows tired of cleaning up the messes of wealthy people and figures out how to get in the game. Story 19. The Kurgan in Highlander was much more fun than Connor McLeod. Can't go wrong with Clancy Brown. Story 20. Raylan Givens is a great lead character on the show Justified. Boyd Crowder is a top 5 all-time character in my book and more than matches him in appeal. Story 21. Black Panther. Most Marvel Cinematic Universe films are fairly mediocre. Killmonger was the only reason it was an above-average film. The Dark Knight. Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker was legendary. Story 22. Hannibal Lecter, played by Sir Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs, appears on screen for only about 10 minutes. Yet he feels like the star of the film. He is charismatic, in control, and deadly calm. Mads Mikkelsen in the television series Hannibal plays a character who is both protagonist and antagonist. It was a great show. Story 23. The refrigerator in Requiem for a Dream. Grandma knows what she did to get on television. Indulgent, sinful things she must pay for. Story 24. It has to be your father in the game Hades. The voice work and dialogue with Hades himself, voiced by Logan Cunningham, are spectacular. I was excited for every line in that masterpiece of a game. Zagreus was great, but Hades was god tier. Pun intended. Story 25. Char Aznable. The early Gundam works were subversive and anti-war, but also a product of their own time. They presented a conflict in which the point-of-view character clearly sided with the villains while the antagonists were the good guys, and then used every trick they could to convince you otherwise. The problem is they did not have the courage to commit to it. Char is the real protagonist. He is framed as the villain, but the writers chickened out and ultimately portrayed him as the antagonist. Story 26. Does the Gato from Magic Knight Rayearth count? I am not the only Magic Knight Rayearth fan who considers him their favorite character. Story 27. Cornell on Luke Cage. Mahershala Ali was great, a sympathetic, believable villain. Story 28. I am not a huge fan of Marvel, Detective Comics, or superhero movies, but I have always noticed that in 99% of those films the strongest actor is the villain. I was rooting for Zemo in Captain America, the Winter Soldier, because Daniel Bruhl did an excellent job and made the character feel real. Story 29. It has to be Hans Gruber in Die Hard or the Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin Hood. Both roles played by the late, lamented Alan Rickman. Story 30. Roy Batty. You feel for him and his plight and how he said to hell with it and let Deckard live. Then the speech. An awesome villain. Story 31. Juggernaut, Venom, Jason Voorhees, Chucky, Vecna, Anakin, Clayface. Story 32. I am not sure whether you would call him a villain as such, but Tom Hardy as Alfie Solomons in Peaky Blinders. Story 33. It is difficult to say whether I enjoyed her more than the heroes. They were great, but Azula was a very enjoyable villain in Avatar: The Last Airbender. Story 34. No Country for Old Men is largely devoid of a typical hero, but the villain Anton Chigurh is a fascinating figure. This brutal antagonist is the only person in the film who remains true to his principles throughout the story. Story 35. A few that come to mind: Bill the Butcher Cutting, Heath Ledger's Joker, Thanos, John Lithgow character in Ricochet, Michael Keaton character in Desperate Measures. Story 36. Alan Rickman as Prince John in Prince of Thieves, and Cancel Christmas. Story 37. Clarence Boddicker in RoboCop is played to the hilt by Kurtwood Smith. Bitches. Leave. Story 38. The Joker is far more interesting than the brooding billionaire Batman. Story 39. I enjoyed Gollum more than any other character in The Lord of the Rings. Story 40. John Lithgow portrays the psychopathic Eric Qualen in Cliffhanger. Story 41. Not much, but I tend to really like the villains on Elsbeth. Story 42. A few of the Bond villains in the Moore timeline were actually trying to make the world better. Stromberg and Drax come to mind. Story 43. Neil McCauley from Heat is not really a villain, more of an anti-hero, I suppose. Story 44. Gerard Butler's character in Law-Abiding Citizen versus Jamie Foxx's lawyer. Story 45. It makes me sad how many people here only mention Detective Comics villains. Do not watch the movies unless it is the Batman from 2022. They are all terrible. Read the comics and watch the cartoons. Story 46. Clyde Shelton from Law-Abiding Citizen was the hero because he sought real justice after his family was murdered and the system failed him. Nick Rice was the villain. Story 47. In the old World of Darkness setting, the villain faction for mages was the Technocracy, essentially every conspiracy theory you have heard combined with magic and actually in charge of the world. Their premise was that reality is based on consensus, so they work to shape that consensus into one in which technology functions and the supernatural does not exist. This is portrayed as a bad thing because the player characters are mages who want to perform extraordinary feats. However, in the world of darkness, every supernatural faction is harmful to ordinary people. By removing those supernatural threats, the Technocracy becomes arguably the most heroic faction for everyday people. Story 48. Robert De Niro as the Devil Lewis Cypher in Angel Heart. Story 49. It is a shame that James Woods is an insufferable prick because Hades was the best part of the cartoon Hercules. Story 50. Alan Rickman as the Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin Hood Prince of Thieves was absolutely brilliant. Story 51. Renoir from the Expedition 33 game. Alan Rickman's Sheriff of Nottingham. Magneto from X-Men. Story 52. Ghoul Dukat. Every time he shows up, you just know he is going to pull some unexpected bullshit. Story 53. The police officers, including Elle, in Death Note are not technically villains. Light Yagami is the protagonist and they are his antagonists. I stopped watching Death Note because Light kept winning when the police got so close to figuring him out. Story 54, Hannibal Lecter from the television series, the antiheroes in Heat, Castor Troy and Sean Archer when he is impersonating Castor Troy, Lestat de Linecourt from the film, Vincent, Carl Rudolph Starger, Frank Costello, and Calvin J. Candy. These are some of the villains. Story 55. Austin Butler as Fade Rotha Harkonnen. A ruthless, psychotic killer with his own code of honor. Story 56. Tom Hardy's Fitzgerald over Leonardo DiCaprio's Hugh Glass in The Revenant. Story 57. Thanos did it because he believed in and was fully committed to his plan. Story 58. It is an original story that I am writing by myself. Laughing out loud. Story 59. Ultron in Avengers. Age of Ultron. Thanos in Avengers. Infinity War and Avengers. Endgame. Deathstroke sometimes comes close to giving Batman a run for his money. Story 60. Loki. For real. Every time he is on screen it is instantly more fun. The hero is fighting for their life while Loki is just vibing and stealing the show. Story 61. Bane played Smith in The Matrix. He was a better Smith than Hugo. Story 62. I know it's the obvious answer, but I mean the Silence of the Lambs version of Hannibal Lecter. His manners are impeccable. He values decency. He's frighteningly clever. I'd like to set him loose in Washington, District of Columbia, and watch what would happen. Story 63. Randall Flagg in The Stand and his entire evil crew. The Joker is a pretty awesome villain. Story 64. Harley Quinn, though that is probably the fault of Margot Robbie. Story 65. Doyle Hargraves in Sling Blade, played by Dwight Yoakam, says, I can't even so much as be in the same room with a piece of antique furniture. Story 66. As Kingpin, D'Onofrio was much more interesting, while Matt Murdock came off as an insufferable douchebag in the Netflix show. Story 67. Silco in Arcane is partly the voice actor's phenomenal performance and partly that you can almost empathize with why he became who he is. I think he was so well portrayed that Season 2 never had a chance to match Season 1 in terms of writing. Story 68. A Perfect Murder starring Michael Douglas. Every main character lies in this movie, and Michael Douglas is the villain. I cannot muster much sympathy for Gwyneth Paltrow, who is the victim and hero. Story 69. Raylan Givens is a great lead on Justified, but Boyd Crowder is one of the top 5 characters of all time in my book and matches him in appeal. Story 70. Shere Khan wasn't just correct. He had much more personality. Story 71. Negan, that show was getting boring as hell, and he spiced things up. Story 72. Heath Ledger's Joker. Bale was great as Batman, but Ledger stole the show in that movie. Story 73. Alan Rickman, as the Sheriff of Nottingham in Kevin Costner's Robin Hood, stole the show and made Costner seem like a supporting actor. Story 74. Tywin Lannister has a confidence and pragmatism about him. Story 75. Daniel Plainview was interpreted as a villain. I always saw him as a Nietzschean hero. Story 76. I am reading a webtoon manhwa called Moralist Scandal. The husband is a vile piece of shit, but I am enjoying his descent into madness more than the main romance plot. Story 77. John Smith from Man in the High Castle was the most fleshed out and watchable character. His storyline kept me watching the entire time, and it did not hurt that Rufus Sewell is amazing. Story 78. The new season of The Witcher was god-awful. However, Leo Bonhart, the villain, was exceptional. Story 79. Boyd Crowder. I would not say he is better than the hero, but he is equally important. Story 80. Villains make stories. A weakly written villain leads to a bad or boring story. Story 81. Honestly, as much as I adore Sarah and Noel, fucking Tjaus, man. Story 82. Ivan Drago from Rocky IV is not technically a real villain, but he is a villain nonetheless. I recently rewatched the movie, both the theatrical version and the director's cut, and noticed how subtle Ivan Drago's personality is compared with Rocky's. He wants to be the best under the pressure of an entire country and is treated as a tool rather than a human. Despite having little dialogue, Dolph Lundgren made Ivan Drago memorable. Story 83. Honestly, all of them laughing out loud. Homelander, Littlefinger, Cersei Lannister, Ultron, and Thanos are some of my favorite characters. Story 84. General Chong in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Story 85. It is debatable whether he was truly a villain, but Magneto was pretty awesome. He was not a villain in the usual sense. His different approach to solving the same problem made him appear that way. Story 86. Littlefinger, Peter Baelish, was more multifaceted in the books but was also great in the series. Story 87. Vic Mackey in The Shield was played to perfection by Michael Chiklis. Walton Goggins was a welcome addition to the show. Story 88. Darth Vader is known as a quintessential villain who straddled the line between antagonist and tragic hero. As a child, I saw him as an intimidating antagonist, but as an adult I view him differently after learning his tragic backstory. Story 89. Smee, though he is hardly a villain, seems to have a low intelligence quotient but is genuinely likable overall. Story 90. Quality is low-key the best character in the Avatar films. Story 91. Harley Quinn. The concept of Batman annoys me. You would never see a billionaire fighting crime, because billionaires create the environments in which crime flourishes. But a psychologist falling in love with a patient and joining him is beautiful in my opinion. Yes, I'm aware of the contradiction. Story 92. Dr. Doom in the comics and cartoons. Hopefully that will change this year. Story 93. Joker 89. Story 94. All of them. I love a good villain. There is no story without a villain creating conflict. If I had to pick one, I would say Agent Smith from The Matrix. Story 95. Los Angeles Police Department Officer Brian Gamble. Do me a favor. Make sure Fuller knows I pulled this off. Story 96. Harry from In Bruges. From the first phone call, before you see him, he is very interesting. Is the Swan still there? Story 97. Dr. Doofenshmirtz is peak villain material. Also, any Joker from the movies. Story 98. Say what you want about Farscape or science fiction in general, but Scorpius, played by Wayne Pygram, is one of the greatest portrayals of all time, in my opinion. Story 99. Madara Uchiha was the definition of an aura farmer long before Jinwoo even existed. Story 100. Homelander, Moriarty, Vaz Montenegro, Joseph Seed, Pain and Orochimaru from Naruto, Hannibal Lecter portrayed by Anthony Hopkins and Mads Mikkelsen, and Negan. Story 101. I like the aliens more than the main character in Pluribus. Story 102. The Triumvirate of President Scroob, Dark Helmet, and Colonel Sanders. Story 103. Killmonger. The movie became hard to watch after he gave his speech because he was absolutely right. Story 104. General Zod. After his monologue in Man of Steel, I was entirely on his side against Krypton nepotism and the hypocrisy of Superman's father. Story 105. Definitely the Joker from The Dark Knight. Heath Ledger's portrayal was mesmerizing, even more captivating than Batman in that movie. Story 106. Mr. Whatsit is my favorite character in Stranger Things and always will be. I find him more interesting than the heroes. Story 107. When a villain actually wins in a movie, 99% of the time they are later defeated by the hero. Letting the hero lose sometimes can be more interesting. Story 108. Captain Kennit from the Liftship Traders is my vote for the best written character of all time. Fuck, I didn't even like the series, but I'm a huge sucker for a good gray character, and Captain Kennit has all the shades. Story 109. Kylo Ren. Despite how poor Episode 8 and Episode 9 were, Adam Driver always put his all into that role. Whenever he was on screen, it was a good time. Story 110. I prefer most of Batman's villains to Batman and his Bat family. Comics are rightfully more focused on the villains, but Detective Comics often writes itself into corners, and none of the Bat family seem to learn or grow in a meaningful way. The rogues are more interesting to me because, when writers handle them correctly, they can remain evil while still being engaging and fun. Story 111. I don't know. I found it hard not to like Daniel Plainview from There Will Be Blood, even though he has virtually no redeeming qualities. Story 112. I'm gonna say Luke Castellan, but Leo Valdez is still my Pookie. Story 113. Gore from Thor. Love and Thunder is what really made the film memorable for me. I didn't dislike it, but it wouldn't have been the same without such a unique and compelling villain. He was definitely my favorite part. Story 114. As much as he has been tarnished for me in recent years, Hades from Disney's Hercules. Story 115. Castor Troy from Face Off is an over-the-top character. He is portrayed by two actors and is a villain who pretends to be a good guy. Story 116. Vox from Hazbin Hotel is the best example of this for me. He is vicious, power-hungry, and manipulative, but also funny, ambitious, charming, and absolutely a blast to watch. It helps that the creators cast someone as talented and likable as Christian Borle to play him. Story 117. Maven. The backstory was valid. Queen Lavanna. She's what you call crazy, vain, and amazing all at the same time. Story 118. Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday. Shah Rukh Khan as Bazigar. Alan Rickman as the Sheriff of Nottingham. Story 119. Omni-Man is much more interesting than Invincible. Invincible follows the typical, I was wronged and I'm still just trying to do the right thing superhero trope. Omni-Man is closer to, I was sent to conquer this planet and I could end it all now, but is that the right thing to do? He is literally a supervillain who could end everything immediately but has second thoughts because he loves his son and wonders if he is wrong. That is better than always being right, at least for storytelling. Story 120. Ultron All Iterations Marvel. Ridley, Metroid. Dark Samus, Metroid Prime Trilogy. Samus Aran X, Metroid Fusion. Raven Beak, Metroid Dread. Silex, Metroid. Unicron All Iterations Transformers Franchise. Starscream All Iterations Transformers Franchise. The Joker All Iterations Detective Comics. Noah, also known as N, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and Future Redeemed. Dirk, also known as D, Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Malos, also known as Logos, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Torna. The Golden Country. Mumkar, also known as Metal Face, Xenoblade Chronicles. Alvis, also known as Antus, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Future Redeemed. Story 121. In every iteration, Batman Bruce Wayne is a boring, somewhat ridiculous billionaire with no real powers. Why should I care about him? The villains are always more interesting, especially the Joker. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.